The person who talks less usually knows more. Now, I know some people are going to hear that and immediately disagree. They're going to think, well, that's not always true. And you're right. Not every quiet person is wise. Not every loud person lacks wisdom. But if you've lived long enough, if you paid attention long enough, you've probably noticed something. The people who constantly have something to say usually don't have much to learn. And the people who spend more time observing usually understand more than they let on. Because society has a funny way of rewarding noise. The loudest person gets attention. The loudest person gets noticed. The loudest person gets heard. The loudest person gets the spotlight. But attention and wisdom are not the same thing. Visibility and intelligence are not the same thing. Talking and understanding are not the same thing. And that's where people get confused. Because we live in a culture that mistakes volume for value, the loudest voice in the room is often assumed to be the smartest. The person talking the most is often assumed to know the most. The person with the strongest opinion is often assumed to be the expert. And meanwhile, the quiet person is sitting there seeing everything, watching everything, understanding everything, connecting dots nobody else is connecting, and people completely overlook them. See, one of the reasons quiet people often know more is because they're spending less time broadcasting and more time receiving. Think about that. Every moment you're talking, you're not learning, you're sharing. Every moment you're speaking, you're expressing. But every moment that you're listening, you're gathering information. You're collecting data. You're observing patterns. You're noticing the detail. You're learning, and learning compounds. The person who listens more accumulates more, not just facts, not just knowledge, understanding. And understanding is different because information is easy to get. Understanding takes time. Understanding requires observation. Understanding requires reflection. Understanding requires patience, and patience is becoming rare. Most people don't want to observe. They want to react. Most people don't want to understand. They want to respond. Most people don't want to think. They want to talk. And that's exactly why they miss things. Because when you're constantly talking, you're often too busy expressing your perspective than to understand somebody else's. But the quiet person, they're gathering perspectives. They're gathering information. They're gathering insight. They're learning things about people that people reveal without even realizing it. And you know what's funny? People tell on themselves all the time. All of the time. Most people think you learn about someone when they intentionally tell you something. That's not how it works. You learn about people by observing their pattern. You learn about people by watching their behavior. You learn about people by paying attention to them consistently. You learn about people by noticing what they do when they think nobody's watching. And quiet people tend to be exceptionally good at that because they're not distracted by needing to be the center of attention. They're paying attention. And that's a superpower, a real one, because information is power, not gossip, not rumors, not assumptions. Information. And information comes from observation. That's why emotionally intelligent people often appear quieter. Not because they're shy, not because they're weak, not because they're insecure, because they're thinking, they're processing, they're evaluating, they're considering, they're asking themselves questions. They're looking beneath the surface, and people underestimate them. People assume silence means absence. Sometimes silence means depth. Sometimes silence means awareness. Sometimes silence means self-control. And self-control is one of the most underrated forms of intelligence in the world. Think about how many problems people create simply because they can't control themselves. They can't control their mouth. They can't control their reactions. They can't control their emotions. They can't control their impulses. They can't control their need to be right. They can't control their need to be heard. And because they lack self-control, they create unnecessary problems. Meanwhile, the person who knows how to pause, the person who knows how to think, the person who knows how to wait often avoids problems entirely. Not because they're lucky either, because they're disciplined. See, quiet people often understand something that many people never learn. Not every thought deserves to become a sentence. Let me say that again. Not every thought deserves to become a sentence, and that's wisdom. Because maturity teaches you something. Just because you can say something doesn't mean you should. Just because you have an opinion doesn't mean it needs to be expressed. Just because you have a reaction doesn't mean it deserves your attention. Emotionally intelligent people understand this. They understand timing. They understand context. They understand consequences. And because they understand consequences, they're slower to speak. Not because they have nothing to say, because they understand the weight of words. Words matter. Words build relationships. Words can also destroy relationships. Words create opportunity. Words destroy opportunities. Words create trust. Words destroy trust. So wise people become intentional with words, and intentional people naturally speak less because they're choosing carefully. That's another thing people misunderstand. People think quiet people don't have confidence. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the loudest person in the room actually is seeking validation, and the quietest person in the room already knows who they are. That's a completely different energy. One person is trying to prove something, the other person doesn't feel the need to. One person needs attention, the other person needs understanding. One person is focused on being seen, and the other person is focused on seeing. Big difference. And that's why quiet people often become powerful decision makers, because they aren't constantly reacting. They're evaluating, they're assessing, they're observing. And observation reveals things reactions never will. You ever notice how people reveal themselves when they think nobody's paying attention? The quiet person notices. The quiet person notices who's authentic. The quiet person notices who's pretending. The quiet person notices the inconsistencies. The quiet person notices the manipulation. The quiet person notices shifts in energy. The quiet person notices the pattern because they're paying attention. Most people aren't. Most people are waiting for their turn to talk. The quiet person is actually listening, and listening changes everything. Listening teaches empathy. Listening teaches perspective. Listening teaches emotional intelligence. Listening teaches wisdom. And that's why some of the wisest people you'll ever meet aren't the loudest. They're the most attentive. They don't need to dominate every conversation. They don't need to win every argument. They don't need to prove they're smart. They're secure enough to learn. And that's a powerful place to be, because secure people are curious, and insecure people often pretend to know everything. Secure people are willing to learn. Secure people ask questions. Secure people admit when they don't know. Secure people listen. And that's why they continue growing. Growth requires humility, and humility requires listening. Listening requires silence. See how that works? Silence isn't emptiness. Silence is space. Space is reflection. Space is for learning. Space for understanding. Space for wisdom. And that's why the person who talks less often knows more. Not because they're magical, not because they're superior, because they spent more time learning than performing, more time observing than reacting, more time understanding than arguing. And in a world where everybody wants to be heard, the person who's willing to listen gains an advantage. A huge advantage. Because while everybody else is speaking, they're learning. While everybody else is reacting, they're understanding. While everybody else is broadcasting, they're building awareness. And awareness changes lives. Now let me speak directly to the quiet people listening. The ones who've been underestimated. The ones people assume don't know much because they don't say much. The one who gets overlooked. The one who gets misunderstood. Don't let the world convince you that your silence is some form of weakness. It's not. Not when it's intentional. Not when it's thoughtful. Not when it's rooted in awareness. Not when it's rooted in wisdom. You don't have to be the loudest voice in the room to be powerful. You don't have to dominate every conversation to be intelligent. You don't have to constantly prove your value. Let your understanding speak. Let your consistency speak. Let your character speak. Let your wisdom speak, because eventually people notice. Eventually people realize. Eventually people understand. And by the time they do, you'll already be 10 steps ahead. Not because you talked more, because you learned more, because you observed more, because you understood more. And in the long run, understanding always beats noise every single time. So the next time somebody mistakes your silence for weakness, smile. Because they have no idea how much you've learned while they were busy talking. And that's the beautiful thing about wisdom. It doesn't need to announce itself. It simply shows up in the result. And the people who know the most often have the least need to prove it. And that's power. That's maturity. That's emotional intelligence. And that's exactly why the person who talks less usually knows more.